long road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued to outstretch in front of the vehicle endlessly. The light that shone between the branches of the green trees danced across the window in random patterns, every once in a while obnoxiously shining in your eyes. The surroundings were a deep, full green forest of trees, forming a forest around the road. The only sound was of the car's engine as it traveled down the path. It was peaceful and let off a serene feeling. Although the ride seemed like a nice one, it lacked every form of nice for both the passengers. The middle-aged woman behind the steering wheel had neat short brown hair that fit her complexion quite well. She wore a green v-neck t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. She had deep green eyes, which brought out her shirt. By the lighting, it seemed that they were more noticeable. There wasn't more significance about her appearance. She just looked like any average mother that you see on TV and such, but there was one thing that differed from the average mothers. That was the dark bags under her eyes. Her facial expression was gloomy and sad, although she generally looked like one that smiled a lot. She would sniffle back and look back once in a while in the rearview mirror and look back at her son in the back seat, who was hunched over particularly. His arms were tightly around his chest, his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance. Anyone could blandly see that there was something wrong with him. His messy brown hair went in every which way, and his pale, almost gray skin was brought out by the luminescent light. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's, and he wore a white t-shirt and scrub pants that the hospital had provided for him. The clothes that he wore had been so shredded and blood-stained that they weren't wearable anymore. The right side of his face had bared a few cuts along with a split eyebrow. His right arm had been bandaged along all the way up to his shoulder, which had been shredded when his right side hit the shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful, but he really couldn't feel a thing. He never could feel a thing. That was just one of the glories of being him. One of the many challenges that he had to face growing up was growing up with a rare disease that caused him to completely be numb towards pain. Never ever had he felt himself be hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. That and another major disorder he had faced was the one deeming him the insulting nicknames in the short time he attended grade school. Before he was moved to homeschooling was his Tourette syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while, and kids would tease him and call him Ticci Toby, and mock him with exaggerated twitching and laughing. It got so bad he turned to homeschooling. It was too hard for him to be in a common learning environment where seemingly every kid was poking or merely stabbing for fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window. His face was empty and decapitated motion. Every few minutes his shoulder and arm would twitch, or even his foot. Every bump of the car the tires hit would make his stomach turn. Toby's Rogers was the boy's name. And the last time Toby remembered riding the car was when it crashed. It was all he thought about, unconsciously replaying everything he had remembered before the blackout, and over again. Toby had been the lucky one, when his sister hadn't been so lucky. Continued to seem like what was forever. It took them so long to get home due to their mother wanting to avoid passing the site of the crash. When the surroundings became familiar to the neighborhood, they both were more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their own home. They both quickly noticed an old vehicle that was parked in the front of the house and a familiar figure who stood out in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration take over him at the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled the car up the driveway beside him before turning off the engine and preparing to step out and face her husband.
Why is he here?
Toby said quietly as he looked at his mother, who reached out to open the car door. "He's your father, Toby. He's here because he wants to see you," his mother responded with a monotone voice, trying to sound less shaky. His father opened his arms, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him and put her arms around Toby's shoulders and influenced them to begin walking inside. "Connie! No welcome hug home, huh?" She ignored her husband's obnoxious words and began walking past him with her son under her arms. "Hey, he's 16. He can walk by himself." His father began to follow them upstairs. "He's 17. Connie glared back at him. "Toby, why don't you get to your room and rest, okay? I'll come and get you when dinner is ready."
No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself,
Toby said sarcastically. He glared back at his father before stumbling up the staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it, just a small bed and a dresser and a window, and his walls had a few framed pictures of his family back when they were a family, before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently towards everybody in the family. Toby stood by the window and looked out onto the street. He could have sworn he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but he quickly blamed it on the medication that he was put on. When dinner time had come and his mother called him, Toby came down the stairs and hesitantly sat down to the table across from his father and in between his mother in the empty chair. It was quiet, and his parents picked at his food, but Toby refused to eat, instead just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught onto a stare towards his father and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her and slightly looked down at his uneaten food, in which he didn't touch. Toby laid in bed. He pulled the covers over his head and stared at the window. He was tired, but there was no way he would fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He heard his door creak open. His mother padded into the room and sat on his bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. "I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise you, it will get better," she said softly.
When is he going to leave?
Connie let her gaze fall to her feet. "I don't know, honey. He's staying with us as far as I know," she replied. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few minutes of silence, Toby's mother sighed and stood up and walked out of the room. "Good night," she said as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeches of tires and the screaming of his sister filled his head. He threw off his covers and, laying on his back, he pulled his pillow over to his face and cried into it. He could feel his chest rise and fall as he let out shaky breath as he cried. He could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he didn't press his pillow above his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow off his face as well and sat up, hunched over, holding his head and breathing roughly, tears streaming from his eyes. Suddenly, he heard a ringing in his ears. He looked out the window, and his gaze slowly centered on something standing out on the streetlight. He couldn't look away. A figure stood beside the streetlight, about 2 feet shorter than it. Long arms draped at its sides as it stared up at him with non-existent eyes. The figure had no features whatsoever, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into its very being. The ringing in his ears grew louder and louder every second that he stared before suddenly it all went black. The days went by, and things continued as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning up the house with her rude husband bossing her around. It was just how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would pace around his small room like a caged animal or stare at the window. The unhealthy cycle continued. Connie continued to be pushed around by her husband, being too submissive to him, and Toby remained in his room. Before he could think twice, he would begin to chew on his hand, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw his hand until it bled. When his mother walked in on him doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed him downstairs and grabbed the first aid kit, wrapping his hands. She demanded that he wouldn't leave her side for now and then. All the nonsense landed him in the counselor's office. His mother grew too anxious about his mental health. She decided that it would be good for him to talk to a professional about how he was feeling. Connie walked Toby up to the building. She walked him up to the front desk and began talking to the lady who sat behind it. "Miss Rogers?" the lady asked. "Yes, that's me," Connie nodded. "We're here to see Dr. Oliver." "I'm here with Toby Rogers." "Yes, right this way." The lady stood and led them down a long hallway. Toby looked at the framed artwork down the hallways and tuned into the sound of the lady's high heels on the wood floor. "If I can get him to sit here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor." She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down at the table. Not shortly after, a little blonde-haired woman stepped in with a clipboard and pen. "Toby?" she asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Toby. I'm Dr. Oliver." She put her hand out for him to shake, but hesitantly put it away when she noticed the bandaged hands. "Oh." She smiled nervously before clearing her throat and sitting at the chair across from the table. "So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and you try to answer them as honestly as possible, okay?" She placed the clipboard down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and held his restrained hands to his lap. "How old are you, Toby?"
17.
She wrote this down on the piece of paper that was clipped to the clipboard. "What's your full name?"
Toby Aaron Rogers.
"What's your birthday?"
April 28th.
"Who's your immediate family?"
My mom, my dad, and my sister.
"I heard about your sister. I'm really sorry." Her expression faded into a sad, pitiful look. Toby nodded. "Do you remember anything from the crash, Toby?" Toby looked away from her. His mind went blank for a moment. He looked down at his lap in the surroundings. He heard the faint ringing sound. His eyes widened and froze in place. "Toby?" the counselor asked. "Toby, are you listening?" Toby felt a shiver go down his spine. As he froze once again, slowly looked over at the little window through the door, where he saw it. A dark, featureless figure peering in at him. He stared, eyes widened. The ringing grew louder and louder, until the loud voice of the counselor broke the trance. "Toby!" she yelled. Toby jumped back and fell sideways out of the chair and back up into the corner. Dr. Oliver stood up, holding her clipboard to her chest in surprise. She looked terrified. Toby woke with a start. He screamed out and sat up as fast as he could, completely short of breath. He wheezed out and held his chest with his bandaged hands. It was just a dream. It was just a dream. He lay back on his bed and rolled over on his side. He felt a giant weight had been lifted off of his chest as he took a deep breaths. He stood up and padded over to his window and saw nothing. He walked all the way down to the kitchen But before he turned the corner, he noticed his dad was there having smoke in the living room. Toby waited a second and watched him around the corner where a burning feeling started to develop in him. Deep boiling anger took over him. He heard his imaginary voices in his head. "Do it, do it, do it, do it," they chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over himself, unlike he had in the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had complete thoughts of what just this moment before they had clouded by the chanting of the little voices in his head. "Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him." They continued on. Toby trembled. No, no, no. I'm not going to kill him." What was he going crazy? No, he won't kill anyone. He can't. He hated his father, but hated no one enough to kill them. That was it. The last thought that he had before he fell into the idle state once again. The influence in the voices were too much. He began silently walking behind his father. He reached over to the counter to the knife holder in the kitchen and pulled out the largest knife that he could find resting in the case. He gripped it in the hand, felt the sensation take over his chest. He let out a snicker. He began laughing so hard that he had to gasp for breath. His father turned around abruptly before he felt a brute force shoving him down to the floor. "What? What are you doing, Toby?" He looked up at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. "Toby, what are you doing?" He went to sit up and put his arms out in front of him for self-defense, but before he knew it, Toby was on top of him and went to grab at his neck. His father reached out and blocked his hand by grabbing onto the wrist. "Stop! Get off me!" he yelled. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if demons had taken over him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but blocked him and grabbed onto the wrist once again. But Toby got back up and drove the knife straight at his shoulder. His father let out a loud cry and went to pull the knife out, but before he could, Toby threw his fist straight into his face and began pounding the fist into the head. Laughing and wheezing, he cracked his neck and grabbed the knife and ripped it out of his shoulder and drove it deep into his dad's chest, repeatedly stabbing into the torso, blood spilling out and getting splattered everywhere. His mother saw the whole thing. "Toby, why did you do that? Why?" Toby stood up and began to back away from his father's bloody corpse. He began to walk back out of the kitchen. He looked down at his blood-soaked bandages on his hands and looked up at his mother one last time as before he turned and ran out of the house. He ran to the garage and slammed his hands against the control panel on the wall and pushed the button to open the garage door. Before he ran out, his father's 2 hatchets that had been hanging on the tool rack above the table of jars full of the brim with rusted nails and screws. One hatchet was new with a bright orange handle and a shiny blade. The other was old with a wooden handle and a dull blade. He grabbed both and looked down at the table, and his eyes met a box of matches. Under the table was a red full tank of gasoline. He ran down the street. He heard police sirens in the distance. He turned around and saw the red and blue flashing lights came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second before he pulled open the cap of the gasoline tank and ran down the street, spilling the gasoline all over the street after him. And he turned to run into the trees. He poured the last bit of gasoline box and immediately dropped it. Instant, the flames burst out around him. The flames caught onto the trees and bushes around him, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by fire. The silhouette of the police cars were visible through the flames as they backed away from the forest around him. They looked around and the vision was blurred. His vision was very blurred. His heart was pounding and he closed his eyes for a moment. That was it. This was the end. Toby felt a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked over to see a large white hand with bony fingers resting on his shoulder. He followed the arm that was attached to the hand and towards the dark figure. He appeared to be wearing a dark black suit of some kind. His face was completely blank. He towered over Toby's small frame and looked down at him. Tendrils reached out from its back. Before Toby knew it, his vision blurred. That was it. That was the end. That was how Toby Rogers died. Hey guys, Creepypasta Nerd here. I'm very happy with this performance by Northland Productions and me. I don't think it's the best video I've ever done, but definitely Northland's Productions did it out of the park here, so I think we should give him a hand there in the comments, and definitely subscribe to him. And I might have messed up a little bit more in this video. It's because my tonsils adenoids just came out, and they were still healing during this video, but now they're all good. So, end of October, here we come. Well, it's already November, but who cares about that? Thank you to everybody who subscribed to me. Anyways, Mr. Widemouth is next day or two away from being released. So, yeah, and new announcement, Goofy Gamerism isn't playing Mr. Widemouth anymore. It's actually Word Weaving Gal now. So, please subscribe to her too. And thank you so much to Northland Productions. You are amazing, amazing, and you're like, oh my gosh, you knocked it out of the park here. And I think you're the perfect Ticci Toby, and it's just awesome. Thank you very much.